Right. Right. Hello, everyone. We are in for this week's video, which will be the last for the month of August. So, as I had mentioned earlier this week on Sunday, this video, we are going to go ahead here and do the next president down the line, as I've not done a president's video since early July. So we're going to go ahead here and get the next one in the list done. Of course, today is going to be a relatively major president. This is the president that he is the last one to have been assassinated. He is also one of the ones that had the shortest time of office. He didn't complete a full term, but yet, despite not completing a full term, he has endured in the hearts of many of this nation, and many of his views are something to be admired. And that, of course, would be President John F. Kennedy, or JFK, as many of us often know him by. So we're going to go ahead here today and cover President Kennedy and go through, of course, a little bit of his backstory before he was president, and then we will definitely go in depth with his presidency itself. This could be a little bit of one of those longer presidential videos, only because he is such a vital president, and we kind of want to give him a little bit more of an in-depth look, considering that status. So, as always, we go back to a little bit of the backstory before we go into the presidency. So, for John F. Kennedy, he was born John Fitzgerald Kennedy. That is what the F stands for in his name. And he was born on May 29th, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts. His parents were Joseph and Rose Kennedy, who both came from Irish Catholic backgrounds in Massachusetts. Growing up, John was often called Jack by his family and friends. That was a nickname that did not just end when he came into adulthood, that persisted all of his life. Many of his close friends and family did call him Jack. I believe his own wife called him that at many times. He was also, most notably, the first president to have been born in the 20th century. Before this, every president had been born before 1900. He was also the second of 9 children. The Kennedy family was quite large. They had quite a number of kids. They had, I'm thinking, out of the 9 children they had, I think it was 4 boys, and you had 5 girls. And one of the boys was older than Jack. That was his older brother, Joe Jr. And then, of course, we had all the girls, and then his 2 younger brothers that we very well know, like Robert and Ted. Right. So Jack was only 3, and we'll refer to him as that as we go through his early childhood here and through his early years before he was president. So when Jack was 3 years old, the family would move to a new home from Brookline, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. This would allow their father, Joseph Kennedy, to pursue his career as a local businessman and politician. And Joe Kennedy is going to be a very big influence in getting his sons, all not just John, but also his older brother and his 2 younger brothers, into going into politics and taking careers in public service. This was something that was imprinted upon them by their father, sometimes not to the best intentions. Sometimes I think the father was just wanting some kind of glory for himself, but for most part, he wanted his sons to do well, and he thought, what better way than to go into public service, something that he himself had done, and he kind of pressed his sons into that path. During the summers, growing up around Boston, the family would live at their summer home in Hyannisport on Cape Cod. Jack and his siblings were very competitive when playing, something that was actually encouraged to them by their father, especially amongst the boys. And there were quite a few times, I believe, if I remember reading correctly, that Jack and his older brother Joe Jr. did get into a couple tussles, mostly because Joe, since Jack was really the only sibling that was near enough to him in age of the boys that could pose any kind of threat to him as the oldest child and the favored child, could kind of do anything to kind of usurp that role from the family. And at times, him and Joe did get into it, but for the large part, they got along. Jack would attend Choate boarding school in Connecticut during his schooling years. He made many friends there, enjoyed reading as well as the subjects of history and English. However, many of his educational teachers would state that he was not exactly the best of students. Sometimes he did lack in attention, and he would often play sports while at school. He played sports such as tennis, golf, basketball, and football. He would graduate from Choate School in 1936. After graduation, Jack would enter Harvard University, where his elder brother Joe Jr. was already attending. While his during his time at Harvard, he would play football, but he ended up suffering an injury during his years there, which would rupture a spinal disc. It never fully healed, and thus Jack would be plagued for the rest of his life up until the day he died with bad back problems. There were multiple instances during his life that he had to have back surgeries or back operations done because of damage to his back, all stemming from that incident back in 1936. And Jack also had other health problems. He was not exactly the healthiest person alive. He did have a plethora of health problems, I believe. I can't remember if it was the 1950s or early 1960s, as he's going into the presidency, that he was diagnosed with Addison's disease, which is a very rare disorder. And that was something that at the time they gave him like a year to live. And Kennedy's like, no, I think I got at least 10 more in me. Well, he was about right. I think it was the 1950s that he was, but he was not exactly, point be told, he wasn't the most healthy of persons. He's not the idyllic image always that we view him as. He did have his own health crises. Now, Joseph Kennedy, their dad, was so we'll call him Joseph Kennedy Sr. He was an avid supporter in the 1930s and 1940s of President FDR in Democratic politics. In 1937, because of his involvement in Democratic politics and, helping FDR and everything else, Joseph Kennedy Sr. was appointed ambassador to England. Now, he took the whole family to England to live there during his ambassadorship, with the exceptions of John and Joe Jr., who were attending Harvard, and he wasn't expecting them to cut their studies in the meantime, but he did keep an eye on them through letters and correspondence. And not Joe Jr., Sr. would often send letters to his sons about the growing tensions in Europe at that time. This is right before the outbreak of World War II. We have fascist Italy and Nazi Germany really becoming militant, really showing a threat to world peace. And Joe Sr. would often send letters to his sons about the growing situation in Europe. And due to these letters, Jack would become very interested in European politics and world affairs during his time at Harvard due to these letters that he was getting from his father while he was serving as ambassador to England. After World War II broke out in Europe, Jack was a senior at Harvard as the war ended up breaking out. He ended up writing a thesis on why Great Britain was unprepared for war, which was later published as a book entitled Why England Slept. He would graduate Harvard later in his senior year in 1940. So just before the US gets involved in the war. World War II has broken out, but we are not officially in it yet until about another year. And before we go further here, so here is a picture of the Kennedy family in 1931 with most of the siblings. I believe at this point, the only one not in the picture, I believe, is Ted. Ted, I don't think had been born yet in 1931. This was about a year before he was born. So you have Joseph Sr. and Rose, and then you have their five daughters. And then we have, of course, this is Jack's older brother who died during World War II. He did not make it. This was Joe Jr. And then you had future President John F. Kennedy here, the second eldest. And then this, I believe, is Robert Kennedy. But this is them at Hyannisport in 1931, their summer home on Cape Cod. And yes, Jack, if you want to put it in a way, JFK was born into a wealthy family. He was not by any ways, he was not by any means born into a poor family. Let's see here. That one will show here in a second. That just goes a little bit with the early life here. So in 1941, Jack and his brother Joe Jr. would each join the United States Navy. Joe Jr. would become a pilot, and he ended up getting sent to Europe after the United States entered the war. Jack was made a lieutenant, and instead of being sent to Europe like his brother, he was sent to the South Pacific as commander of the torpedo boat PT 109. Now, Kennedy and his crew of 12 aboard this torpedo boat were assigned to patrol the waters off the island of Guadalcanal in 1943. This was an island that the U.S. was fighting to take back from the Japanese and the Solomon Islands. And their job was to intercept any Japanese ships that were attempting to resupply the forces on the island. So, if any Japanese ships were coming in with troop transport, supplies, munitions, anything like that, you are to intercept and torpedo them and sink them. On the night of August 2nd of 1943, a Japanese warship it was a Japanese destroyer, ended up ramming PT-109 in the middle of the night, splitting it in two and killing two of the crew before the ship ended up sinking. The stern section sank pretty much immediately, but the bow section actually got pushed and drifted off until morning with Kennedy and his remaining other crew members on it. And they stayed on the top of this bow section before up until until sunlight came up, and then they kind of realized that the bow front section of the ship that had survived the collision was not going to stay afloat much longer. It was going to sink, and they ended up sighting an island nearby, by where the point where they had drifted off to. And Kennedy had injured his back in the collision, which also didn't help his back problems. He had had his back thrown against the pilot's seat, and he did manage to save his men, including one of them whom he had suffered severe burns, and thus he really couldn't swim. So Jack took his the strap of his life jacket in his teeth and actually swam to Thor on this nearby island, holding him by his teeth in his life in holding the life jacket strap and towing him by his teeth to the island they were swimming to. They ended up getting rescued about 6 days later by the U.S. Navy. Now, Joe Jr. was not as lucky as Jack had been during World War II. He unfortunately was tragically shot down in a flying mission over Germany in 1944. Jack would be awarded after the conclusion of his service in late 1944, I believe it was. I don't think he served until war's end, if I can remember correctly. He was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for leadership and courage, and his father convinced him to enter politics, something that he had previously hoped for Joe Jr. And this was a big switch because Joe Jr. had been the eldest child. So Joseph Sr. had kind of planned for, since he was the eldest, he was going to be the main one that he wanted to take up in his footsteps. So Joe Jr., up until his death in 1944, was the main child that Joseph Kennedy Sr. was putting a lot of the pressure on to enter public service, become a politician, maybe even become president if he could. With Joseph Jr. now tragically deceased, he now shifted his focus on that idyllic career to his second eldest, JFK. And he kind of pressed his second eldest son to take up his brother's place and kind of do what he had kind of said that your brother should become. So this is going to start what will become Kennedy's political career, going after World War II. And here is a picture of Kennedy during World War II aboard the torpedo boat that would later get sunk. This was him aboard PT-109. And this is the same area that when the collision happened, his he got thrown up against the back of this solid, I'm gonna guess, steel, and he ended up injuring his back even further during the force of that collision. I believe they found the wreck of the torpedo boat off Guadalcanal, I believe, and it was 2002 they ended up finding it, but they did end up finding at least the bow section that they had kind of drifted off on. So in 1946, Kennedy would return to Boston. He prepared to run for Congress as a Democrat, much like to be expected. He was going to go into the political party of his father. He easily won nomination with his father's backing. He won election over with a 3-to-1 margin over the Republican opponent in the working class 11th district in Massachusetts. Upon entering Congress as a representative in the 80th Congress in 1947, Kennedy immediately got attention, both positive and negative in some ways. He was only 29 years old. So, mind you, you have to be 25 to even run for the House. So he's very, very young to be in the House. He has a very youthful appearance and he's very relaxed, but he's also informal at times. And while he did get a lot of attention in the House, he didn't always get the best attention. Some people called him naive, some people called him too young, stuff like that. And when he got into the Senate, there was another controversy that ended up coming up that we'll just mention here in a second. Kennedy would win two subsequent terms to serve in the U.S. House, both 1948 and 1950, so he would serve a total of 6 years in the House. In 1952, he would defeat popular Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge in a race for the U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts, and he would become a senator from the state in the 1952 election. In September of 1953, shortly after he was elected U.S. Senator, Kennedy, age 36, would marry 24-year-old journalist Jacqueline Bouvier, or as many people would know her as Jackie. And she would officially become Jackie Kennedy. Of course, one of the most iconic first ladies probably ever to grace the halls of the White House. Now, early in their marriage, Kennedy's back problems ended up causing him to have two serious operations, and one of these came under a little bit of a scrutiny because of the factor it was during the time that Joseph McCarthy, the Wisconsin Republican senator, was facing some starting to get backlash finally to his allegations of, communists in the government, and people were starting to wise up to his scheme. And the Kennedys, especially JFK's father, had been friends with McCarthy for a number of years, and they were very hesitant to, publicly come out against McCarthy. And on the day of the now, Kennedy had made it clear that when the vote came to censure McCarthy, that he did plan to vote in favor of it, but because of his back surgery, he ended up being absent from the vote. So although he got censured regardless, it didn't look good on Kennedy because some people already knew, the Kennedys are close with McCarthy, and somehow conveniently Kennedy got out of the vote by having back surgery on the very day that the vote was scheduled to take place. And that caused a little bit of a controversy at the time. During his years as senator, Kennedy would also write the Pulitzer Prize best-selling book Profiles in Courage while he was recovering from his surgery. Kennedy, whose popularity was growing, would almost become the Democratic vice presidential nominee in 1956. Unfortunately for the Democrats, Kennedy declined as he kind of correctly predicted, as many people had, that there was probably not a very good chance of ousting very popular President Dwight Eisenhower, and he kind of knew that wasn't probably going to happen, so he did not want to attach his name to the ballot, thinking that incorrectly guessing that it would be defeated in 1956. However, he did intend to run for president in 1960. In 1957, he and Jackie would welcome the birth of their daughter, Caroline, and Caroline, to this day, is the only surviving child of President John F. Kennedy. Their other child that was born, JFK Jr., unfortunately, most people know he ended up tragically getting killed in a airplane accident in 1999. On January 2nd of 1960, Kennedy announced his candidacy for the presidency. He would defeat more liberal primary challenger Hubert Humphrey in the Democratic National Convention, and then he would ask his former primary rival and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson to be his running mate in order to attract Southern votes. Now, Johnson was a little bit of a different pick for Kennedy. Many people didn't understand why he picked him because him and Johnson were two completely different personalities. Kennedy was more outgoing, more friendly, up to the touch. Johnson could be friendly, but if he wanted something from you, he was not afraid to let you have it, and he was not afraid to get in your face. And Johnson he had been in the Senate for a number of years at this point, far longer than Kennedy had, and he had actually challenged Kennedy for the Democratic nomination. He came in rather late to the game, thinking that he could somehow get a behind the scenes victory, and that did not happen. Well, one of the main reasons that we know of that Kennedy probably picked Johnson to be his vice presidential candidate was that Johnson was from Texas. Kennedy was from New England. He wasn't all that popular with many Southern Democrats, and he would need Southern support if he was going to get into the White House. Johnson is Senate Majority Leader. He's from Texas. He does hold some sway with Southern Democrats, and thus it could have been a major reason why Kennedy likely chose Johnson to be his VP. Because on other times, they did argue a couple of times, especially going into the election. They argued over strategy and tactics of how to win the campaign. Johnson, during the White House years, I don't know if there's as much evidence of him arguing with Kennedy as often, but he definitely didn't always see eye to eye with the man. And unfortunately or fortunately, give your take of the man, Johnson would end up becoming the next president when Kennedy was assassinated, which we'll be covering him when we do the next video. And he's a whole bundle of fun. So after picking Johnson as his VP, Kennedy and Johnson would not that Johnson was by any means young, but Kennedy in particular would present a far more youthful ticket to Republican Vice President Richard Nixon, who at this point was only really a couple years older than Kennedy, but he looked far older than his age. And he would present a very youthful ticket to Republican Vice President Richard Nixon, and his running mate, very coincidentally, Henry Cabot Lodge, the man that Kennedy had beaten for the Senate in 1952, ends up being the Republican vice presidential nominee with Nixon in 1960. And yes, we know Nixon will also become a president later on, but this is Nixon's first time he tries to get in there. He tries to run right as he's leaving office as vice president to succeed, President Eisenhower, who he served under for 8 years. and he barely gets squeaked out of a victory. They ended up having one televised debate in October of 1960, which was among, I think it was the second presidential debate to be televised, in which Nixon ended up floundering. Kennedy had come in a couple of days before the debate to kind of prepare. He kind of asked where the camera was, like so that way when during the debate he would know where to look. He knew like to kind of look into the camera when he was answering questions, so the audience could see him, not look at the people themselves. He also kind of got a hint of how bad what the lighting would look like, what kind of clothing would contrast against the lighting so people could see him better in a more clear image. And Nixon, not that Nixon didn't want to prepare, but he had just come out of the hospital from a bad knee injury, and thus he hadn't had the time to fully prepare for this like Kennedy had. And during the debate, Nixon at many times he wore a kind of a light colored clothing that kind of blended in with the background because he didn't know where the camera was. He many times when answering questions looked directly at the interviewers. He did not look at the camera, which didn't look good on television. But one of the strangest things that happened was watching the debate on television thought that Kennedy had pretty much trumped the debate, that he had won it. But people listening over the radio, listening to solely the talk points, not seeing the visuals, thought that Nixon had gotten it. The 1960 election was extremely close. I think the ultimate vote tally, I think it was less than 500,000 votes that got Kennedy his victory, and it was a very close election. This was the first election to have all 50 states, as Alaska and Hawaii had just become states the year before. So there were 269 electoral votes that were needed out of 537 in order to win, one less than there is today. For a majority, you needed at least 269 electoral votes. That would be the make or breaker. Kennedy would get 49.72% of the popular vote. Nixon got 49.55%. That kind of illustrates alone just how close this race was. This was like a hair trigger split. The electoral vote count, Kennedy would come away with 303 electoral votes. Nixon would get 219. Kennedy only won 22 states. Nixon won more states. He did win 26 states compared to Kennedy's 22. The difference was Kennedy's states that he ended up winning had a lot more electoral votes than the ones that Nixon got, something that I think a lot of people nowadays seem to struggle when they look at an electoral college map and they might say, well, look at all this blue or look at all this red. How on earth did we lose this? Well, it doesn't really matter the size of the land geographically, it matters over the amount of people living in it. And I think that's something a lot of the people have struggled with, especially since 2020, I've noticed. And I think we all know why that was. I mean, we're not going to go in depth there, but that was a whole nother debacle mess. That it was over exaggerated to almost every degree and lies, just constant lies to people that got them to think in a way that was not at all the truth. So the Kennedy, upon his election, he is the youngest man ever elected president at age 43. Now, Teddy Roosevelt had come into office at a slightly younger age, at the age of 42, upon the assassination of President McKinley, but he was not elected when he first came into office. So to actually be elected outright, Kennedy is the youngest man to have been elected president because by the time that Roosevelt won his reelection in 1904, he was older than 43. He was also the first Roman Catholic president. To date, we've only had two Catholic presidents in the United States history. Kennedy was the first, and the second one was, and he's still living, Joe Biden. Joe Biden was the second Catholic president. Shortly after the election, on November 25th of 1960, the Kennedys would welcome their second child, John Jr. So that brings us to JFK's presidency. And here we'll show a couple images before we advance into that arena, because this is going to be a little bit longer. So here is a picture of Kennedy during the 1952 Senate campaign. Him at the Democratic nomination, just when he got into the Senate. Here we have an image of Kennedy with Nixon on the televised debate stage in 1960. Kennedy is the one on the far left over here. So this is Kennedy. Here's Nixon at the time. This was kind of the debate that made or broke the campaign, depending on which candidate you were. And here is the electoral map from 1960. And again, as we said, Nixon did win more states in number. But look at the electoral vote counts of many of these states out west. It looks like, oh, look at all this red. He should have got that. He didn't because the population didn't match up. Look at all these states in the West, like 4 electoral votes, 4, 6, 8, 6. Now look at the ones up here that Kennedy got. And he did get some Southern wins because of Johnson. 24, 14, 20, 27, 45, 32, 16. It's a lot higher numbers. And that's what ended up getting him the presidency. And of course, in the first election with Alaska and Hawaii, they split along what they kind of do today. Alaska went for Republicans and Hawaii went for Democrats. It's kind of odd how they always do that. And then here is some pictures of the family that we'll go ahead here and show. So this is a picture of, well, this one is from the White House years. So this is, I mean, they're both from during the presidency itself, but it's some better pictures of them. So here's a picture of him and Jackie in the White House, Christmas of 1962, with the big Christmas tree in the background. And Jackie was very active first lady compared to some of her predecessors. She actually, one of her first big things that she did upon coming into the White House was she remodeled, had a big old remodel done of many of the White House rooms and renovated them. And then she actually gave like press tours and televised tours of the new changes and remodels to the White House so the public could see them. And one of the ones that she did, I believe, was the Rose Garden. She ended up redoing the Rose Garden, which only recently, under the second term of President Trump, has been modified drastically since she had done it back in the early 1960s. And then here is a picture of them with the two children in 1962. So we have John, we have Jackie, and then we have Caroline, who's still living, and then we had John Jr. And then here we have a picture of President Kennedy at his inauguration in January of 1961. And it was a very cold inauguration. It was very cold. If you actually watch uh, tele, the televised recording of the inauguration of him giving his speech, you can actually see when he's speaking that his breath like coming out. You can see, the breath turning into that cloud because it's so cold outside. So one of Kennedy's Well, we're skipping ahead here a little bit. So, on January 20th of 1961, Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th president. In his inaugural address, Kennedy implored Americans to be active citizens. Probably one of the most famous lines that he ever noted was during that first inaugural address, where he noted that ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that kind of spurred a whole generation of Americans to kind of enter, public service, volunteer, civil service, everything else. So the first part of the presidency that I think we're going to cover here, because it's possibly one of the larger ones here, is the foreign policy. This would be something that would dominate Kennedy's. It would dominate his presidency in many ways. Some of the biggest events from his presidency came out from foreign policy, and it's something that I think that we need to take a look at. So, one of Kennedy's earliest foreign policy endeavors as president came in April of 1961, just 3 months into office, and it was not exactly a success. And this was, of course, the very big famed Bay of Pigs invasion. It was an approved CIA plan to send 1,400 trained Cuban exiles to invade the island of Cuba and oppose the Castro regime, the Castro communist regime that had been set up 2 years prior. It landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, but they did not get the support that they were promised, and they couldn't even make headway. And thus, the whole invasion ended up being an absolute failure when most of the exiles ended up being killed or captured upon arriving there. And then the U.S. just kind of abandoned them to kind of act like they had nothing to do with it. It embarrassed Kennedy. Kennedy would also create Peace Corps in 1961, which is still ongoing. It allowed Americans to volunteer to help developing countries with areas like education, farming, healthcare, and construction. Kennedy thought that by helping to develop countries, it would make them far less susceptible to communism and thus kind of help them out. They would not be likely to fall to communist aggression, and thus, if they had a developed country, they were less likely to want to embrace it. And that was something that Kennedy ended up going with. And to this day, the Peace Corps has had over 200,000 Americans join over the course of its lifetime. It's something that's still ongoing. And here is a picture of President Kennedy in August of 1961 with Peace Corps volunteers. Many of them look like they are young men and women. In June of 1961, Kennedy would attend the high risk summit in Vienna with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Now, the most pressing issue at this summit was Berlin. The German capital, Berlin, had been divided between amongst into four sections at the conclusion of World War II. It was still divided now, nearly 20 years later, just like Germany was divided between East and West, and it was divided between the pretty much the Western powers had gone in and they consolidated their three zones into West Berlin. And then you had the Soviet Union zone, which was East Berlin. And Berlin was within the Soviet satellite country of East Germany. And the Soviets kind of wanted Berlin reunited as part of East Germany. They didn't think the Allies had any need to be there. They thought, okay, we just want to unite with. Basically, they wanted to set up a full on puppet state like they already had. And the Soviets wanted to reunify Berlin under East Germany since a large number of East Germans had been fleeing East Germany and East Berlin through Berlin itself. They've been going into the western part of the city, which was under Western administration, and thus they could live democratic, free lives there. And many of these East Germans, fleeing the oppression and repression of the communist regime in East Germany, were fleeing across into West Berlin. The summit went poorly, much to international dismay. Kennedy came out very angry, feeling that he had let Khrushchev bully him, and Khrushchev, in turn, was impressed by Kennedy's intelligence, but he came off thinking that Kennedy was rather weak and that he didn't have, the fortitude and strength to actually challenge the Soviet Union or anything, which would have drastic repercussions within a year. Kennedy would make clear, however, at the summit that any treaty interfering with U.S. access to West Berlin would be an act of war. Both leaders kind of came away thinking that nuclear war was a possibility within the next few years, which was not good. In the weeks following, an additional 20,000 people would continue to flee into the West Berlin sectors. Kennedy would announce in July that any attack made on West Berlin was an attack on the United States, and that if the Soviet Union made any such move, the United States would respond militarily. He would also increase NATO would increase its troop presence there, and Kennedy would add about $3.25 billion to defense spending in order to rearm. The Soviets would respond by stopping further east west crossings and building the Berlin Wall in late 1961, which was a massive concrete wall between their sector of East Berlin and West Berlin. And it had like barbed wire. It even had like two smaller walls on the outsides, and they had guard powers that if you tried to go over this wall, you would be shot solely, and it would divide neighborhoods. It would go right through someone's backyard just to divide the two sectors. The Soviets wanted to pretty much keep people from fleeing East Berlin because it wasn't working to the communist image. If communism was so great, why are people fleeing to the West to get away from it? And I believe the quote was from Kennedy, but I could be wrong. But one of the later quotes that was said about the Berlin Wall was, "Capitalism may not be perfect, but at least we don't have to build walls to keep our people in." Kennedy would later go back to Berlin before his assassination in late 1963. It was in June of 1963 that he would go back to Berlin and give his very famous Ich bin Berliner speech to the people in West Berlin to oppose the Soviet Berlin Wall. Now, Kennedy's biggest foreign policy challenge, and possibly the most famous, and one that I think that we might do a separate video about here, just because it's such a monumental, pivotal moment in human history, was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. This was the closest that humanity has ever come to an actual nuclear war to this day. Not to say, I hope to God it never comes that close again, but we came relatively very, very, very close here, like just one order away from a nuclear war. And you'll see what I mean here in a second. So, in October of 1962, the U.S. Air Force, with its spy airplanes, had ended up actually detecting and discovering several Soviet nuclear missile sites being constructed on the nearby island nation of Cuba. This would place, once completed, Soviet nuclear armed missiles less than 90 miles from Florida. And because it would be so close to the continental US, these missiles could basically hit any major US city. They could target almost anywhere in the continental US with ease. Now, Kennedy's advisors advocated for an immediate airstrike of the sites, blowing them to kingdom come, and an invasion of Cuba. However, Kennedy knew that this would likely spark a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and he wasn't quite prepared and willing to take that drastic step yet. Kennedy announced a blockade of Cuba on October 23rd, and all Soviet ships approaching Cuba with any missile supplies or military hardware would be stopped and searched. And this would not go well with the Soviets, who kind of argue that this was an act of aggression, that this was not something legal. So it did amply raise up tensions quite a bit. And the Soviets had these shipments of military missiles and everything else under military guard themselves. They had Soviet warships and submarines accompany these ships to Cuba, and when they came to Cuba, they found the U.S. blockade. Luckily, they didn't engage. They seen the blockade, they did approach it, but then they turned back around. At the same time, an American U-2 spy plane ended up getting shot down by mistake, which spiked the tensions even further. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who was the president's younger brother, he would inform the Soviet ambassador a couple days after the initiation of the blockade on October 23rd that he informed the Soviet ambassador that Kennedy, and this was under his brother's direction, under the president's direction, that the U.S. would be willing to remove Jupiter missiles, American nuclear missiles, from nearby Turkey after the crisis ended if the Soviets were to remove the ones in Cuba. Telling the Soviets, we'll do a trade off here. You remove the ones from Cuba, we'll remove the ones from Turkey, which are right on your border, even though Turkey was a NATO nation and still is. On October 28th, Khrushchev would agree to withdraw and dismantle the missile sites. In exchange, publicly, the United States promised that it would never invade Cuba. But privately, Kennedy also conceded to removing Jupiter missiles from both Italy and Turkey in exchange for the withdrawal of the Soviet nuclear sites. Khrushchev and Kennedy, realizing how close the two countries had come to nuclear war and realizing that they must never come to that point again, started to take measures to try to drastically de escalate tensions between the two countries. One of the most significant improvements that was made as a result of this was a direct Moscow to Washington hotline, which was established to ensure clear communications between the two nations in order to ensure that the two leaders could talk to each other at any given time in a crisis like that. Kennedy's approval rating would jump from 66% to 77% as a result. Now, I mentioned that this came rather close, and it did, because there was a specific instance that we didn't find out about until 2002 about a certain Soviet submarine that almost fired a nuclear torpedo, and it came only one order away. And before here, we'll show a couple of these images before we show the image here to explain what happened. So here is Kennedy meeting with Soviet leader Khrushchev in June of 1961 at Vienna, where the two kind of did not have the greatest impressions of each other. Kennedy kind of came off that Khrushchev had bullied him. Khrushchev kind of came off that Kennedy was weak. And here we have a picture of a U.S. plane flying over a Soviet ship that is approaching the blockade that will be intercepted if it tries to press through it off of Cuba. And then here is the submarine in question. This was U-59. It was a Soviet submarine, and then above it we have a U.S. military helicopter. They had been forced to the surface by the U.S. military dropping depth charges because it was trying to run the blockade. Now, the story with this is the submarine that almost caused World War III because aboard the submarine, they were authorized to fire a torpedo if they were depth charged. And what ends up happening, they end up getting depth charged to bring it to the surface. The men inside didn't have a working radio time, and they thought, okay, well, war must have begun. Why are they depth charging us? They wouldn't drastically take that step unless war has begun. So, under that circumstance, they are prepared to fire a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. Now, the U.S. ships that were depth charging the submarine did not know that the submarine was nuclear armed. They did not know this. Now, luckily for the situation, the launch of a nuclear torpedo in this instance would require the approval of the sub's two acting commanders and the commander of the squadron that it belonged to. It's on the submarine, and what ends up happening here is the two commanders, they want to fire the torpedo. Soviet squadron commander says, "No, we're not firing the torpedo. I don't think there's actually been a war." Because of that decision, it does not fire the torpedo, thus not starting World War III. So we came that absolute close to a war actually breaking out, to a nuclear war. Now, Kennedy would also escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And this is one of the great what ifs if Kennedy had actually lived further. He would increase the number of military advisors and funding for the South Vietnamese to fight against the communist North Vietnamese regime. At the conclusion of Eisenhower's presidency, the number of advisors to Vietnam, of U.S. military advisors, had been around 900. Kennedy escalated that to 16,000 by the time that he had got assassinated. And in January of 1962, he would authorize the use of Agent Orange to combat guerrilla fighters in the country itself, which was the herbicide that would kill the plant life, but at the same time, they didn't know it was also having adverse health effects. In September of 1963, Kennedy would say on a TV interview that ultimately Vietnam was a Vietnamese war, but that the U.S. would be wrong to withdraw from it. Now, there has been a lot of debate in the years since whether or not, if Kennedy had been reelected in 1964, if he had not been assassinated, if he had been reelected in 1964, if we would have continued to escalate our involvement in Vietnam. I don't know, if I can't say for certain what my own opinion is, because I want to say that we would know, but at the same time, I don't know. So I can't say with any definite guess of mine what I think it could have been. I think it could have went either way. And that brings a lot of what is to American history. If we don't get more escalated in Vietnam, would we have had the involvement in the Vietnam War that we did? That ended up coming under Kennedy's successor, Johnson, who got a lot of the blame for his drastic uptake and involvement in the war. Now, Kennedy, during his time in office, he did end up souring on South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, whose authoritative crackdowns on protesters would increase internal opposition to his regime within the country. Diem would actually be assassinated in a CIA-backed coup on November 2nd of 1963, just 3 weeks before Kennedy's own assassination. In July of 1963, Kennedy would also sign a joint U.S. Soviet ban that would limit nuclear testing as one of his final penultimate foreign policy achievements. So that brings us. Okay, here. So here is a picture of Kennedy actually signing the blockade order for Cuba on October 23rd of 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I don't think any of these other ones are. Yeah. Okay. So that brings us to Kennedy's domestic policy. At home, Kennedy would focus on his what he called his new frontier domestic policy. He would initially struggle due to his slim 1960 victory and lack of influential congressional connections and focus on foreign policy. Kind of robbed him of a lot of the achievements early on in his domestic policy. In 1961, Kennedy would advocate several bills that would provide federal assistance for education, medical insurance for the elderly, housing legislation, and increasing the minimum wage. Some of these succeeded, some of them did not. A bill to increase the minimum wage to $1.25 passed, but laundry workers were exempted due to a conservative amendment added at the last minute. Excuse me. The Housing Act and Area Redevelopment Act both provided funds for urban renewal, public housing, and $394 million to aid economically poor regions like Appalachia. He would also Kennedy would also authorize federal mortgage loans to those unable to qualify for public housing. Bill to what A bill to provide $2.3 billion in educational aid to the individual states failed to pass the House, so it did not pass. And there was another bill to introduce to pay for the hospitalization and nursing costs for the elderly, which would also fail. Later, that would be created with Medicaid by the Johnson administration that would succeed him. In 1963, Kennedy would sign the Community Mental Health Act, which would fund local mental health community centers and research facilities. Now, Kennedy's administration ended tight fiscal policies when it came into office. The economy had actually been in a bit of a recession during the last half of the Eisenhower years, and this was something that Kennedy had inherited. And he brought to a close a lot of the tight ended fiscal policies to trying to let the economy kind of come out of that recession and on the flow again. And this did end up working. It brought the economy out of a recession. He kept low interest rates during his administration, which encouraged economic growth. GDP ended up growing by 5.5% between 1961 and 1963, and industrial production in the country would rise by about 15%. Kennedy would also voice a plan during his administration to cut taxes by approximately $10 billion. Now, this was opposed by Republicans and Southern Democrats, and the tax plan did not pass until after his death in 1963. It would officially end up passing in 1964 under President Johnson, which the actual tax bill would pretty much mirror what Kennedy had been proposing for several years prior. In 1963, Kennedy also signed the Equal Pay Act, which would abolish wage disparity based on sex. Basically, a woman could not legally make less than a man due to the fact that she's a woman. Kennedy would also show increased support to NASA after American success in 1961. Alan Shepard that year became the first American to travel in space, and John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. And this is marking the United States trying to catch up to the Soviet Union in the space race. Now, at a speech on May 25th of that year, Kennedy voiced his declaration that NASA should pursue putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. He thought that this would be a way to beat the Soviets at the space race by being the first one to do a manned moon mission. And this would spurn the creation of the Apollo program that would ultimately fulfill Kennedy's dream in 1969 by putting Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Now, Kennedy was slow to commit to civil rights, but he was eventually forced to do so by events. He used federal troops to desegregate the University of Mississippi in 1962, and in August of 1963, he endorsed the March on Washington by several civil rights leaders, and which it had thousands of African Americans attend and other civil rights activists, and announced his intention as a response to propose a massive civil rights bill within the coming year. So here is a picture of Kennedy at the 1963 State of the Union address. And here is a picture of him meeting with several of the major civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. of the March on Washington in August of 1963 in the White House. So here in the middle somewhere, here is Kennedy, and then right here is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Unfortunately, Kennedy's great advancement in his presidency would be cut short. In the fall of 1963, Kennedy was preparing to gather support for his 1964 reelection campaign. He decided to travel to Texas to try to drum up Southern support there for his reelection, knowing that that would be a vital region that he could not afford to lose. On November 22nd of 1963, on a Friday, the Kennedys landed in Dallas, Texas to speak at an engagement. They had already spoke, I believe, at Fort Worth and maybe Houston or Austin, I think the day before. I can't remember which one it was. They ended up going through downtown Dallas to travel to the next engagement that he was going to speak at by motorcade, and it was open air motorcade, as we all know. I mean, this is not an event that I think is stranger to most of us. Shortly after 12:30 p.m., while passing through the downtown area, shots ended up ringing out, which ended up killing Kennedy. He was hit in the head and the neck by two bullets at least. Of course, you have the magic bullet theory too and all that hogwash and everything else. But nonetheless, Kennedy ends up dying. He ends up getting assassinated. He's the fourth and last president to have been assassinated. The culprit that ends up getting captured is 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. He ends up getting arrested, but then he himself is killed 2 days later while he is being officially brought in, being transferred and everything else. And a guy steps out of the crowd and ends up shooting the guy dead out of retribution. Now, a presidential commission led by Chief Justice Earl Warren back in the 1964 concluded that Oswald had acted alone, that he had been the sole accomplice. Oswald had been a known communist conspirator. He had been a known communist sympathizer, and that kind of put some suspicion on him at the same time. But some of the details, in my personal opinion, don't seem to line up entirely. And I can't say I'm a definite conspiracy theorist on this one, but I do kind of question the actual commission's report that said Oswald acted alone. I personally believe there is a good possibility there could have been a second gunman, given how the shots ended up lining up. I do personally believe that this could be an assassination that I don't think we know the true story of quite yet. But nonetheless, Kennedy ended up dying tragically, and he ended up getting buried shortly thereafter in Arlington National Cemetery. So here is a picture, probably one of the most famous images from that day. This is just moments before the gunshots ended up ringing out that killed him, of him sitting in the motorcade with Jackie, and he would be shot just moments after this photograph was taken. And then here is a picture of his casket lying in repose in the East Room. Jackie Kennedy, during the planning of her husband's funeral, actually planned many of the details to kind of emulate and mirror that of Abraham Lincoln nearly a century before. From lying in state in the East Room to lying on the Lincoln catafalque that held Lincoln's casket back in the day, she kind of emulated a lot of it off of that funeral. And the nation was in mourning for some time. There were multiple tributes to Kennedy. There were multiple newspaper articles. There was a Associated Press book that had come out with nothing but photographs of the day that he ended up getting shot, and following the press coverage of the funeral and everything else. And then just literally January of 1964 was the first time that this one was made, but and to this day he's still on it. The first Kennedy half dollar was made in January of 1964, just 2 months after his death. He was placed on the half dollar, and it's kind of a tribute to him. And then this is a little newspaper clipping that I have from one of my deceased grandmother's old booklets, where she had actually clipped a newspaper clipping from December 29th of 1963. So this is just a little over a month after the assassination, showing a picture of Kennedy's grave in Arlington, just covered in flowers at the time. So that concludes for President Kennedy. Again, one of our more tragic presidents, but at the same time, I think definitely in the upper half of them. For a president that was only in office not even a full term, he accomplished quite a bit and left a lasting legacy that has transcended, I think, multiple generations, and it's something that still holds on today. So despite him having a tragic ending, I still think that he's one of our best presidents I think we've had in terms of ideals and everything. So that will conclude for him. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, any added information, anything like that, any suggestions for future videos, be sure to put that in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to go through them when I get the opportunity. I do not know if we're going to pursue our next Japanese going into World War II video next week, or if we're going to push that another week and cover something else next week. I don't completely know. I'm going to still go through that. So if anyone has any suggestions, feel free to put them in, and maybe we'll do one of those instead before we do another one of those. So hopefully everyone has a good Labor Day weekend, a good holiday weekend, and we'll see you all back here for that next video when it comes out.